say? One. My friend, Dr. Rafael Delgadillo is our speaker today. I'm going to tell you a little bit about him. Rafael is a public historian, researcher, and tour guide whose work focuses on New Orleans as a critical crossroads in the Americas. He currently serves as a research associate at UNO. He earned his PhD in Latin American and Latino Studies from the University of California, Santa Cruz. His dissertation, Layers of Contestation, Contestation, New Orleans as a vital node in the Americas, 1830 to 1859, examines the city's deep political, cultural, and economic ties to Latin America and the Caribbean, newly relevant Latin America and the Caribbean, illuminating its role as a site of influence, resistance, and exchange for the hemisphere. Since January 25, he served as a research associate for the Economic Justice Studies Research Lab at UNO. And on weekends, he leads Latin American connections in the French Quarter in San. So he is Spanish speaking about it. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Delgadillo. Hello, everyone. Can y'all hear me? Yeah. Okay, good. Okay. So, thank you very much, Craig, for the introduction and for inviting me to speak in front of y'all. Yes, I've got my PhD. I work at UNO. The truth is that I get the most amount of pleasure from being able to talk to folks like y'all who just have a deep passion for the city's history that need to be in some university office classroom. I think I'm in the room with peers so we can love this house history and we want to preserve it, preserve its stories, right? And I'm here to share with you my research. Please just make sure we put their words. Right, so I'm not going to read very much. Most of you are just going to see all of the images that I've got here. I also do want to mention that a big piece of my passion about history is that I grew up here. The family came to the Dominican Republic, but we moved here when I was 6 years old. And from the time we moved here, I became enamored with city's history. From an early age, I could see just how closely connected the town was to the Caribbean, how similar it is in its culture, its cuisine, its architecture. And it's been an absolute pleasure to most recently. So to get started, on August 21st, 1851, an event that came to be known as the Lopez Riot erupted in the city of New Orleans. On that day, an innumerable mob supporters of the filibustero campaign of Narciso Lopez and his failed attempt to invade the island of Cuba and liberate from Spain attacked Spanish-born residents in New Orleans. The mobs targeted Spanish individuals, their businesses, and local Spanish citizens, including the officers of one Spanish newspaper, La Unión, and the office of Spain's Constance. It was a violent and dramatic event that, despite no large laws, caused international uproar from geopolitical crisis between the Spanish Crown and the United States. The United States federal government even paid reparations to the victims of the Lopez Riot with local pension. The matter was so contentious that U.S. President Millard Fillmore dedicated 1/5 of the State of the Union message to addressing the riot and the embarrassment that it caused the country on the international stage. Fillmore used his message to publicly denounce the rise of filibustering as a means of U.S. expansionism and underscored his administration's diplomatic protocols to the nation and the world. This ordeal raises several questions. First, why did the Lopez Riot even take place? Second, why did it happen in New Orleans? Lastly, why did it happen when? I argue that during the first half of the 19th century, New Orleans emerged as a cultural and political crucible, a site of social contestation, and a hemispheric crossroads in the Americas because of the historical forces set in motion in the late 18th century, which transformed the entire hemisphere from a collective of European colonies and from cooperation of independent nations. In other words, New Orleans' post-colonial era was affected not just by the purchase of Louisiana from France by the United States, but also by a variety of overlapping forms of social and political contestations, each of which were reshaping geopolitical realities in the Americas. Set against the backdrop of forced liberation and rising nationalism, these forms of hemispheric contestations placed movement of people's ideas and culture to the crucible of New Orleans. And just to talk about this image really quickly, what I've got here is, the Lopez Riot is dated August 21st, 1851. a map of the city of New Orleans from about that time. I believe that was published in 1945. That image below, I think, is I really fell for it when I saw it because it places New Orleans right at the center of the hemisphere. And that you'll see it where it says important news. That's a headline from the morning from a newspaper whose reports led to the riot because the news arrived on the morning of August 21st, 1951. And we'll get into the details of how that triggered the riot. And below is a headline from a Spanish language newspaper reporting on the riot a couple of months later. And what you see here is a modern satellite image of several of the places that were attacked during the riot. It's not all of them, but it's nearly comprehensive. I'll note that the first instances of violence occurred in La Cabina Cigar Shop, which is on the corner of Ravier and St. Charles. Would have been right across from St. Charles Hotel. It was a tobacco shop. Anything it's that it wasn't. Again, that's my argument later in text, but again, I want to draw you to this map, because of course we're celebrating our 250th anniversary of independence in this country. But what I always think we need to keep in mind is how that was the first domino to fall in the States. And by 1800, we see this map where all the territory in green still belongs to the Spanish, territory in yellow is modern day Brazil, which belongs to the Portuguese. But within 30 years, all these colonies are free, right? And so with the American Revolution and the Haitian Revolution, we got these dominoes start falling. And then the real movement for independence in Latin America starts in 1808 when Napoleon, 5 years after selling off Louisiana to the U.S., invades Spain and Portugal. And a lot of people don't know that, but by closing those royal families, it triggered a political crisis in Latin America that led to the independence movements. And within a generation, the entire hemisphere was free, or at least sustained. And I think this is something that's really important to understand when we try to figure out why New Orleans emerged as this significant city during that time. One of the things that's important about this city's history that's connected to the map that I just showed you is that New Orleans became the site of the first Spanish language newspapers in the United States. Beginning in 1808 with the publication of the newspaper all the way on the left of Mississippi. The reason why this is related to what's going on in the continent, or the hemisphere, I should say, is because this newspaper seems to have been specifically published to inform Spanish residents in the city of what was going on in Spanish Empire. Because of the deposition of the King of Spain and the crisis in Europe, it was harder to get news coming in directly from Spain. They would have gotten it from Cuba, but all those information flows were disrupted. And so we can see the emergence of Spanish language newspapers in New Orleans, the first city in the United States with such a newspaper. And what I found out through my research is that, the Spanish language newspapers of the 19th century in New Orleans, they only lasted on average between 2 or 3 years, but there is a consistent presence. And what we've been able to find out is that there's been a Spanish language newspaper serving New Orleans and its metro area every single decade since the we still have Spanish language newspaper being put today. In 1851, we got a newspaper entitled Delgadillo, which is actually, as I mentioned, the Lopez Riot destroyed one of the offices of the only Spanish language newspaper in the city. About a month after the riot, Delgadillo starts being published to be the voice of the Spanish residents who were attacked. In 1863, and Port Union is being printed during the Civil War, which I think is interesting because these newspapers, one thing that was common about is that not only are they being sold to the Spanish population, the Spanish population here in New Orleans, they're being sold in Britain. They're directly being advertised to buyers in Cuba and in Mexico. And in Havana and Veracruz, these newspapers are circulating, sure. And for me, significant to me, I'm not a Civil War historian, but it's in 1863 and it's being advertised being sold in Cuba. So that tells me that there was some sort of lift of the blockade that the Union had imposed on the Gulf of Mexico after they were victorious and taken over New Orleans. And in 1888, 1890, we got a newspaper being published by one of the victims of the Lopez Riot. And this newspaper, when you read the maps, it's directly, this purpose for this newspaper is to develop the commercial relationships between New Orleans and Latin America. So who are reading these newspapers? Well, we get a really good glimpse into this by looking at this memoir written by a man named Lorenzo de Zavala. Really quick, Lorenzo de Zavala was a moderate Mexican politician who was a governor of one of the states of Mexico during the 1820s. Mexico earned its independence by 1821. And Mexico was, it really had a trouble stabilizing itself during its first 30 to 40 years of existence. And one of the things that happened is that he was a moderate, he was in government, but then at the end of the 1820s, military right-wing dictatorship takes over Mexican government, General Santa Anna, one of the many times that he served as dictator of Mexico. And because of his moderate politics, he was kicked out of Mexico. In 1829, and ends up in New Orleans between 1830 and 1831, which is a memoir. I wish I could get into the details of the memoir with you, but I encourage you to read it. It's so old that it's in public domain. You can find it on PDF, and it's in Spanish and in English, which is really helpful. But he is going through New Orleans, spends about 2 weeks in New Orleans in 1830, and he's examining the city's culture and society as a Latin American. And it's really interesting the take that he has on the city and how familiar it seems to him in many ways, but how odd it also seems to him. For example, we can tell that the culture and society of the French Quarter, downtown New Orleans, is very different. And he even talks about there being different states within one, right? But when he gets into town, when he arrives in 1830, he has this to say. In that city, a few Spaniards were publishing a newspaper entitled El Español, paid for by the government of Spain. It was established as a vanguard for Spain's attempt to retake Mexico. My arrival in New Orleans was announced by them with gross insolence, while La Oreja, the newspaper and the Louisiana Advertiser, spoke of me with the praise and respect always due to the unfortunates. So what we see is he's getting to New Orleans in 1830, and there are competing Spanish language newspapers arguing about his presence in the city, right? And that itself becomes an interesting question. He cites a newspaper called El Español, which I was able to find a record of in a bibliography of Spanish language newspapers. And it just shows us that there was a Spanish language readership. Now, who would have been here in the 1820s? Well, one thing I will say is that there's a class of migrant in New Orleans history in the 19th century that I feel like we completely forgot. And these were the Spanish Mexican schools. These were Spanish-born residents of Mexico who mostly worked in government or owned businesses, who were expelled by the Mexican government during the 1820s and 1830s because they felt, this was again a right-wing dictatorship that did not feel that Spanish-born residents would be faithful to the Mexican state. So they expelled tens of thousands of them. How many landed in New Orleans? I do not know. I would say that there would be no less than 1,000. But when you look through the directories and the records, you see the amount of Spanish language names increasing in the 1820s and 1830s. That it could be more than 1,000. It's really unknown. It's something that needs to be studied. But these expulsions were kicked out in a series of laws passed between 1824 and 1835. And about 1,000 of them, I would say, end up in New Orleans. And they ended up founding banks, other businesses, tobacco shops, this and that. Some of them were able to maintain their connections to Cuba, because Cuba was still a Spanish colony, and there's still some Spanish crown. What I've got here on the left bottom is a map of Mexico during the 1820s, with different states of Mexico colored with colors. This is an excerpt from the laws, from one of the laws of spelling, in 1827. And this one, the was built by Cazadores de Orleans, which was a militia that these Spanish Mexicans, the Spanish-born Mexican residents, formed in the 1820s. And in the 1830s, they commissioned, I'm forgetting his name, the same guy who built the St. Louis Hotel, he built this mausoleum. One of the recent pleasures I had is on All Saints Day, I decided to just drive around town. And I said, let me go check out and see if the St. Louis #2 Square Freewood, where this mausoleum is located, and I went in, and they were it doesn't look like them. So Catholic Charities, I found out, has a program where they sequence the fixed mausoleums like this, and they flash it. It looks exquisitely beautiful now compared to this picture. Um, so to give the contextual, broader context again, what is situated is that, on the map there is I've drawn New Orleans and cities in which the Spanish language newspapers definitely had correspondence. So we see that the Spanish language newspapers are being formed by events and journalists in Latin America. But I also want to make a remark on, because as the hemisphere is becoming this geopolitical region of its own, it's still breaking its chains away from Europe, right? And so what we see in the 1830s and 1840s that the United States as an empire is ascending. While it's gaining territory, it's expanding. We see the annexation of Texas, we'll talk about it, and then the Mexican War. And Spain at this time is losing all of its territory, nearly all of its territory in the Americas. And so it's in decline. Cuba is one of the few properties, one of the few colonies that Spain is able to hold on to, but it is struggling for liberation. There is an independence movement in Cuba, but Spain got a great time circling that island. And we see that Mexico at the same time is struggling for stability. They're independent, but it takes them a while to regain any sorts of stability as a state. Again, to continue the history context, I want to bring this to your attention. During the 1830s and 1840s, the United States was crafting medical necessity to justify its determination for territorial expansion, while the rest of the Americas were going through separatist and sectionalist movements that fractured and dissolved some of the earliest republics in the Americas. The U.S. would eventually endure the reality of separate secession movements in the Civil War in the 1860s. And just to give you an example, the small country of Uruguay in South America used to be part of Brazil. And in the late 1820s, not only did Brazil become its independence from Portugal, there became a separatist group that eventually wanted Uruguay to become independent. Haiti used to actually control the entire island of Hispaniola until the Dominican Republic was able to break away in 1844. We have the country that used to be called Gran Colombia, which was a combination of Ecuador, Colombia, and Venezuela. They lasted for about 20 years before they broke up in 1839. We have the United Provinces of Central America, which formed in 1821, including the five countries of Central America. They lasted for about 20 years before they broke up in 1840. Then we have different separatists and secession movements in Mexico, Texas, California, and the becoming part of the United States. But there were other separatist movements in Jalisco and Yucatan and Baja California, which didn't ultimately succeed and were brought back into the Mexican state. But then again, the United States, while this is going on, is enjoying relative stability. Yet that secessionism and separatist movement does come to us in the 1860s. So for me, I of course, the U.S. is successful in many ways, but in many ways, I see it as being a country a lot like the other countries in the Americas due to this segregation. And when we think about this, this sort of separatism and this fragility of the Americas, what I want to point out is that this is something that people in New Orleans took advantage of. This is something that they were interested in taking advantage of. For example, in the 1830s, we got this newspaper called True American that I believe actually this is in 1840. I know it's not very legible, but that's a poem dedicated to the Texas Revolution. It's being published in a newspaper here in New Orleans. They definitely want Texas to secede from Mexico. Then after the Texas Revolution, Texas is annexed to the United States in 1845. Below that, I've got a map of the Mexican-American War. And then I want to bring your attention to the Delgadillo, which was a paper that was entirely behind the Mexican-American War. In fact, I've got an excerpt for an article here just to read the underlying part. For years, New Orleans editors urged the annexation from Texas, and throughout early 1846, they vigorously agitated for the war with Mexico. When that war finally came in April 1846, New Orleans, its closest major American port to Mexico, became a staging area for military outfit. And then the Delta, during the Mexican-American War, published this poem, which is dedicated to the support of the war. So we see that New Orleans is playing an integral role in the geopolitics of the hemisphere. One thing that we have to keep in mind is the world is watching, right? And the Mexican-American War, the annexation of Texas, is something that makes everyone in the Americas is very nervous, especially Spain, because all they got at this point is Cuba and Puerto Rico. And they know because of the espionage, the network of spies that they had in New Orleans, they know that there are businessmen in New Orleans that want to go for Cuba, right? This is not something new. And what ends up happening is that, like so many other countries, Spain expels a lot of these activists who want independence. And a lot of them end up in New Orleans. A lot of them ended up in New York, but a lot of them ended up here. And the movement for Cuban independence really takes off here. There's men like Benson Castilla and his business partner, Curia, the men of Jose Cisneros, Puerto Turna, and Jose Gonzalez, who's pictured wearing Confederate uniform. They're writing pamphlets, organizing Cubans in the city to support Cuban independence. Of course, that doesn't happen for another 40 years or so, 40 to 50 years, but they were integral in that. This is the community that actually created the Cuban flag. And as I'll talk about in another slide, these filibustering campaigns are what brought the Cuban flag. The first time that flag flies over that island is filibusteros from New Orleans that bring it to them. And during the 1840s, as I said, came out for political exiles. This is where it gets a little fun for me to produce this. This is one of the fun parts. So this is actually the title of one of the chapters of my dissertation, The Fool, the Filibustero, and the France. And it demonstrates this really tense period between 1849 and 1851, where geopolitical tensions between the United States and Spain are escalating, right? And it starts, it's really related to what's going on in Mexico and Texas, but then it really gets teamed up with the story of Francisco Rey. We'll talk about it in a second. Then Narciso Lopez, who was the leader of the filibuster movement in New Orleans. And then this is a headline from the morning of the Lopez Riot. These are all related. Of course, Narciso Lopez is, his story is related to the riot that's named after him. But this is going to demonstrate a time of a lot of tensions. So the water, you guys, we got it. So Juan Francisco Rey was actually born Juan Francisco Garcia. And he may have been born in Spain, but he came to New Orleans via Cuba. I'm not sure, that's something that I'm still investigating, but if he wasn't born in Spain, he was more than likely born in Cuba. But in 1849, he helped two inmates escape a prison from Havana to New Orleans. He was offered $12,000 to help him escape and never got it. That's why I call him the fool. $12,000 in today's money would be about $250,000. So that's a lot of cash. And he was promised that of the two inmates, one of them is actually in prison because he is an activist fighting for independence. And I'm forgetting his name right now, but he's, man, I wish I could remember his name, but he's actually one of ended up starting pro-Cuban newspapers in New York. He got to New Orleans and caught a train up to New York City. But the Cuban community in New York was a lot more active and passionate than the one in New Orleans. From the weekend side. But so he's stuck here in New Orleans. And then what happens is that the consulate in Spain finds out about his presence here. And that's just also mention it. So the first inmate is a political activist revolutionary. The second one is a man in prison for fraud. And his name is Vicente Fernandez Delgado. His brother, I'm going to talk about a little later, is a businessman in New Orleans who owns coffee shops and tobacco shops. Their uncle is a man named Pedro Blanco Fernandez, who was a notorious man involved in the slave trade, right? So he was, from the evidence that we've seen, their uncle was the owner of the outside, right? So that's another time into that history. But he's stuck here. He becomes stuck. He changes his name to Juan Francisco Rey, because he's an alias, because the Spanish consulate finds out of his presence. And they spent literally weeks trying to butter him up. They ended up abducting him from the city, forcibly taking him to Spain. I wish I could tell you the details of this. My dissertation is available online for free, so I encourage you to download it and read it because it's entertaining, especially this chapter. Interesting, I shouldn't say entertaining, but it is entertaining. And he was abducted, forcibly taken back to Cuba. When the reports come out, this caused an international uproar because American sovereignty being violated by the Spanish consulate. And what we learned, and other historians have said, is that the Spanish consulate was a spider. And I'm reminded, I'm not going to get too much into politics here, but remember 2016, President Obama expelled some Russian diplomats because they were involved in Russian collusion. Make of that what you will. But I remember the reason why I remember that, and it drove my research, is there was a headline that said, spies, President Obama expelled spies for posing as diplomats. And the key analyst said, spies do not pose as diplomats. Diplomats are spies. And that's always colored the way that I approach the research into this area, into the spirit of New Orleans history. And so he eventually is returned to New Orleans. He disappears from the record for a little while, but it does cause an increase in the tensions between New Orleans, between the United States and Spain. But what's important is that those tensions can be felt on the ground, right? Spanish language newspapers hate him because they're pro-Spanish. The English language newspapers who want to take over Cuba are all on the side. And it illustrates kind of tensions that we've been dealing with. So now on to the filibuster movement. It's funny because the week that Juan Francisco Rey is returned to New Orleans, we did the first expedition of Narciso Lopez's filibuster movement, and he ends up with Narciso Lopez. He was from Venezuela. He fought against independence of Venezuela. So when the Bolivarians win, he gets expelled from Venezuela. He ends up in Cuba fighting for the Spanish army. Cuba but then turns on them and becomes part of the rebels who want to fight for independence. But the Spanish government wins, and so they kick him out. He ends up in the United States, first in New York, where he becomes a darling of the press. He was, there's a story that say it's true. He was one of the first celebrities of the newspaper, right? He really bought into himself. He written about him, and so he organized this. In filibustering, without getting too much into it, it's a movement to organize and recruit private armies to invade lands, right? I don't know how it got turned into a Senate act, legislation, but the original definition is organized private armies to invade Latin America. And he organizes this army in 1849, mostly in New York and DC. It's about 1,000 men and a couple of ships, right? Steamboats. They make it down to Round Island off the coast of Mississippi, Barrier Island. But the U.S. Navy gets wind of it. They blockade the island, force the men off of it, and they were out to go home with no charges. So that expedition failed. That's why I call it 1849 Round Island. But while he was in the South, Narciso Lopez does come to New Orleans, and he realizes that there's a lot more interest for his filibustering campaign in New Orleans than there were at Cuba, right? Because what these filibusters want to do is take over Cuba so they can expand slavery. Remember, in the beginning of 1804, with the Haitian Revolution, one of the greatest, crimes of humanity was the gradual eradication of slavery from the hemisphere. And it starts in 1804, but progressively you're starting to see it happening throughout the hemisphere. And by the 1850s, the majority of the countries of Latin America have abolished slavery. And the United States, Cuba, Brazil, and Puerto Rico were really holding on to it. And that's what they wanted to do. They wanted to expand it. So in 1850, they come back, organizes about 600 men. They take off from New Orleans carrying a Cuban flag. They get to the town of Cardenas where they win a couple of battles in that city over 2 nights. They raise the Cuban flag, but then the Spanish army comes back with more force, and they fight them off. They get on their boat, and the Spanish troops chase them via boat all the way to Key West. Again, they are arrested, but they're eventually let go. They don't have to deal with much, but they return for a third, Narciso returns to New Orleans for a third campaign in 1851. He organizes about 500 men, gets a steamship from the owner of the Daily they meet him, and they take off in early August of 1851. They land in Cuba, and one of the things about Narciso is grossly underestimated the support he would get in Cuba. He eventually got none. He thought for some reason that once he landed in Cuba, that the people of Cuba were going to come to his aid, that he would be greeted as a liberator. But that doesn't happen. Instead, the Spanish army's ready for him. They capture them. They capture all the soldiers. They massacre, execute all of the leaders, including Narciso Lopez's garage in Havana. These are two depictions of him from 1850. The first one is depiction of him landing with a version of the Cuban flag that's kind of inaccurate there in the back. But that's more of a positive depiction. The second one is a political cartoon, basically exposing him for the grift or the scammer that he was. So let's get to the actual riot, right? Because what happens is, and I'm going to read off the timeline. Hopefully, it doesn't take too long. But just to give you an idea of what happened. So the third Lopez campaign, the expedition to Cuba, completely fails. And then, steamships at that time, there was a mail, a system of steamships that would deliver mail between New Orleans, Veracruz, and Cuba, Veracruz, Mexico, and Cuba. And there was one such boat called the Empire City that was going to be coming on August 21st. And people knew that this with the ship was going to be news of what was going on, but also if there was any mail between Cuba and New Orleans that would come on that ship. So people knew that there was going to be news coming. So 8 a.m., the steamship, the Empire City, arrives in New Orleans from Havana. Mr. Prudencio, who's the secretary of the Spanish consul, was on board and on that ship. And he had actually been given letters by the American prisoners, the American filibusters that had been captured. They wrote letters to their loved ones, and he was supposed to drop them off at the post office here in town. Which the time we've been down over the Popeyes on Canal Street, they would have been right across the street from there. That's what the post office school. And he was supposed to start that up. For some reason, he hit automatically, right? So that's important. So by 10:30 a.m. there are placards being posted all over town. Sometime in the morning, threatening to attack the offices of La Union, the Spanish newspaper, which at the time was located in Shakedown. These placards are likely what led to the tensions at La Colina cigar shop on Grandview in St. Charles. The shop employee, a man named Gonzalez, got into an altercation with local supporters around that time, but we're going to get back to something else happens there later. At 2 p.m., Mayor Abdul Crossman is made aware of the plans to attack the newspaper and calls upon the Spanish consul with hopes of getting him to persuade the newspaper not to publish the edition if the content was down. At 2:30, now you don't print it in extra edition because it only printed 3 times a week. And so that day, because they got the news, they printed an extra edition. There was likely an editorial, assumably pro-Spanish spin that basically castigated the people who had died in capturing in the Lopez expedition. The city's postmaster reported hearing the plans to attack the Spanish consulate around 2 p.m. He tried to notify the mayor, but was unable to do so. At 3 p.m., the Spanish consul abandoned Juan Narciso Lopez. Arrives in the mayor's office at the bill to discuss the issues of the day. Since to try to reach the editors of La Union, the newspaper, without knowing that they had already published the extra edition. At 3:30, the attack on La Union commences. The office is torn up, destroyed. They take out the printing press, the office is destroyed. So that's how we know there must have been a lot of men. We don't know how many. Could have been 100. I would say I've landed on the number of 100 because it happened with the steamship. They organized 500 men. They took off. By the time they get to the edge of St. Bernard Parish, close to the mouth of the river, they realized what was sinking, and 100 of them had to get off. I'm convinced that it was 600 men who had to go back to New Orleans and probably started a while, but I don't have hard evidence of that. But it would make sense. They would have been very distraught hearing the news. At 4:30, the attack. There's a second attack on La Corrida, the tobacco shop on the Grandview in St. Charles. The shop's clerk ends up stabbing the man. So this is the only blood loss that we know of. This is the only actual. There was violence or fights. This is the only time that someone actually got injured, attacked, in true blood. At 5 o'clock, the attack on the Spanish consulate takes place between 5 and 6 p.m. The consulate sign was torn off, then burned in Lafayette Square. During a sort of rage public meeting, another attack on the Spanish cigar store on St. Charles Avenue took place. At 5:30, an unruly crowd gathers at Chocolate Tulips and Pointers near Crossman, addresses them and gets them to disperse. At 6 o'clock, the crowd returns to the consulate after the police were there and they start to tear it up again. They broke furniture, paintings of the Queen, Queen Isabella II, and for the Spanish flag and pieces throwing out of the Bourbon Street. The Spanish consulate at the time was on Bourbon and St. Louis, I mean. And documents are thrown all over the street. There's actually ads in the paper asking for people who have seen documents. But kind of at 8 p.m. near crossing learns of the attack in the Spanish consulate, hours late, but that's how crazy it was that day. And the unruliness continued into the night, and there's evidence that suggests that there was fighting into the next week, though not as organized as this. And here we have a list of the places that were attacked. The first one was the consulate. Then we're talking about different cafes, things like that. Here, underlying spacing saying in Spanish, this is from Spanish newspaper that there are victims who are not listed here. And like again, I said, those break-ins or places that I haven't been able to verify that were attacked were somehow related. Like I thought the mayor's office there, it wasn't attacked, but it was a significant site in the day of the riot. What happened after the riot? That's a depiction of Narciso Lopez being rioted in Havana in a Cuba newspaper. Yeah, if you actually look, those are the officers being fired upon by a firing squad. This is meant to send a message, obviously. And it became a geopolitical nightmare for the United States. And the president at the time, Lou Fillmore, picture here looking like Al Baldwin before the invention of the haircut. It's saying about the first name Donald Trump in the 19th century, right? But he has to write, like I said before, he wrote a State of the Union speech where he spends the first 20%. You should go and read it. And you can actually find it on YouTube. But the guy that from Law and Order, the whole series where he reads all of the State of the Union address. What's his name? Sam Donald? Yeah, but it's great. But literally, and I counted all the words. I mean, not by hand, but put it through the word counter. 20% of the speech is dedicated to the embarrassment that New Orleans caused the nation, which I think is just kind of cool, right? It wouldn't be the first or the last, right? But we see that June of 1853, about 3 months after President Fillmore's last day, the money's delivered to the people that have promised reparations. And there's a list of people, these aren't all of them, but the total, and you see that there's different people, depending on how much damage they got, they're getting different amounts, but it amounts to almost $4,000, which in today's money would be $2.5 million. So, it tells you how tense it was, right? But also I want to examine just a little bit what else did it tell us. And by the way, this newspaper is available on the National Archives. There's 52 copies. I downloaded and printed all of them for my dissertation. It was really fun going through them. Of course, if you don't read Spanish, it won't for you, but it's a cool artifact to have. But Delgadillo, just going to show you the front page bit. But what I highlighted here is sort of reporting on the riot itself. But then we got some ads here that tell us a lot too. The first squares at the top are coffee shop and tobacco shop, which are announcing to the public that they prepared their shops and that customers are welcome to return. This guy up here, Jay Fernandez, he's actually the brother of Vicente Fernandez, the guy that tricked Juan Francisco Rey with promises $12,000. That's his brother, right? And it's their uncle who's the illicit slave trader that probably owned Johnstown, right? And he remained in New Orleans until he died in 1906. And when he died, this is how that actually the picture started for me. I saw his obituary. It's the length of the column. And we all know, if your obituary is the length of the column in 1906, that means you were a pretty important or well-known person. So he was the person who New Orleans would have known at the time. He had a standing in a lot of people. Down here, we've got Benny Lopez, and I'm not going to read it all, but he's a salesman. And he sells property. He sells homes, rural lands, and human beings. This is a slave sale act, Spanish, in New Orleans in 1851. And this is an act of the Hotel Contact Ronda. And just, I'm going to read this part in Spanish, and I'll tell you why I think it's significant. As contact the charters, the Villa Levy, which is the contact between charters and Decatur. Ese magnífico hotel, recién compuesto, ofrece, basically saying that this is a good hotel right in the quarter. But we allow means that they serve food for their guests buffet style. And then at the bottom of this, where I really find interesting, says se recomienda para los españoles y mexicanos. So they recommend this place for Spaniards and Mexicans. Now we know that Spaniards are in town, But I got to think, it's like, why would they be advertising Mexicans? And do we know Mexicans that are here at the time? And the answer is yes. Because during the 1850s, like I said, that Cuba was struggling for liberation, and that led to Cuban refugees being present in New Orleans. Mexico was struggling for stability. And that right-wing dictatorship that returned in the 1850s kicked out Mexican liberal politicians, and they ended up here in New Orleans. Now, here's the thing: they ended up here by happenstance. They came here on purpose because it was a port city in the middle of the hemisphere, that this would be a great place where information could be disseminated. So the reports that they needed to know what's going on in Mexico and other parts of the Americas, those reports, those papers would come here first before they get disseminated to other parts of the country. But they also did do fundraising here and also acquired arms, which they ended up doing, and they sent back to Mexico. Of course, Benito Juarez, who was the only indigenous man to serve as president of Mexico, was here during that time between 1853 and 1855. From New Orleans, this group, and there's several more of them, you saw I only picked 5 for this, but they're able to, from a distance, organize money and arms to help the revolution like that starts here in Mexico and ends up kicking out that right-wing dictatorship, military dictatorship established for the very last time. Benito Juarez becomes president of Mexico in 1858. He's there until 1872. His time in New Orleans is memorialized by the Benito Juarez statue on a basin in Pantai. And then last 2 years ago, the Mexican consulate put up a plaque in St. Anne Street just off of Bourbon memorializing. It was the 20th anniversary, and they wanted to memorialize Benito Juarez's time in New Orleans, but also. I think, I also wondered why they would place it at St. Anne and in Bourbon, because the evidence that I've seen suggests that these Mexican liberals, they actually stayed in several different places. Benito Juarez, particularly as a dark-skinned indigenous man, had trouble getting jobs here, and so his life was a lot more precarious, where someone like said out many amounts of didn't get jobs as a waiter, significantly pay higher wages than what Benito Juarez did, which he ended up actually working in rolling tobacco. Which, if you know about the history of the city back then, most of the tobacco rollers were enslaved, right? So he probably would have gotten meager wages. But we know that they stayed in different places. Jose Maria Mata even writes a letter to another Mexican saying that he had to leave his hotel in the French Quarter to a boarding house on Annunciation Street uptown. And he complains about how in that part of town, nobody speaks anything other than English. And that he feels quite lonely on the other side of Canal Street. That's Mexicans are writing this about New Orleans in the 1850s. But there's an article published in 1870 about a month after the Mexicans defeat the Europeans and Emperor Maximilian, which had been sold by the French. And that article was published in New Orleans time and praises Benito Juarez for being able to lead Mexico to defeat Maximilian's forces, because that was for us, that was a violation of the Monroe Doctrine. And we couldn't do anything about it because they invaded Mexico in 1862. We were in our Civil War. But guess what? As soon as the Civil War ends, Abraham Lincoln starts sending arms to Mexican forces in order to wage this war, which they went 2 years later. And he's being praised in a newspaper here in New Orleans. They're calling him a hero to his people and all that. But then when you get down to this bottom half of the newspaper article, they start referring to him with those racist tropes. They call him a savage. They, basically say that Mexicans are beneath Americans and stuff like that. But it also, that article mentions him living at a boarding house in St. Anne. And I think that's why the Mexican consulate put that plaque there. Now, it's hard to verify. I do know from reading Spanish newspapers, there were ads for boarding houses on St. Anne. It's quite possible, but I don't know if we'll ever be able to figure that out. But with that, move to my last slide, get back to why did the Lopez Riot happen and why is it a significant event? During the first half of the 19th century, I hope I'll be able to show you that New Orleans emerged as a crucible in the Americas, excited social conversation and a new spirit political culture in the Americas. Historical forces set in motion in the late 18th century, which transformed the entire hemisphere from a collective of European colonies into a conglomeration of independent nations. The Lopez Riot signifies a moment in the hemispheric history where all of these forces came together in one place, particularly New Orleans, produced a local event that created a geopolitical crisis for the United States, one that was born out of the American emergence and its own geopolitical region. Thank you. Do we have time for questions? Yes, sir.
Were there any of the Spanish language newspapers that went by, like, Alabama, poetry, as well as the beat? Did any of them come Spanish?
So my knowledge, no. The ones that were bilingual were usually owned by local American newspaper editors. And they decided to translate. But the ones that were started by Hispanic journalists, they were typically just stayed Spanish language.
Gotcha. And one more thing, as a 1980 graduate of the University of Vermont, you make me very happy.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
So much history that I never read about.
Yeah.
So, and so fast. So I can give us some reference.
Huh?
So give us some reference to go read more details.
There's some biographies about Marvin. I mean, you know what? I would direct to my dissertation. And there's a lot of, I've cited everything, but if I could be a little promoting, I would encourage you. It's not that long. I intentionally didn't want it to be 300-page dissertation without 160 pages, and I try to make the chapter about by 1849 as engaging as possible. That gets a compelling story. Yeah, there's a bibliography. Yeah. And I talk a lot more about, for example, Lorenzo de Zavala and his insights onto the world's culture and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And where find the archives for the Spanish language newspaper?
The National Archive. And I think at this point, what's happening is that the public library found out about them, and so they can guess. Yeah, they have no microphone for it, Anyone else? Just go over.
I find it very interesting how much power newspapers had back then. When I was in Cuba, they were saying that the New York papers had supported Castro, who was taken over Mexico, and that's what gave him the power because he really didn't have a strong power.
Yeah, it's incredible what you can do. I mean, we're still dealing with that power of media. Right?
So just a quick comment, I Googled Rafael Delgadillo dissertation, came right up. So very easy to prove.
It's called layers of condensation.
I thought it was easy to remember your name.
Yeah.
Does it have a lot of the images or the dissertation?
It's not in my dissertation.
Okay.
Yeah, the images are not in my dissertation, but they're in the PowerPoint.
And we'll have a recording available. It's like, yeah. Any other questions?
I don't have a question, but I do have a comment, which is absolutely fascinating. I'm really riveting and making connections for me anyway that I never got. Thank you.
Thank you. That's my intention. I'm glad that it's understandable. Because this can be real boring sometimes. That's Thank you.
Every month, I wonder why I understand. Thank you.
Anybody else? Thank you all for coming out. I hope everyone has a wonderful mortgage loan. Please.
I think his flash drive's probably on.
Yeah, I got mine.
Okay.
But
We'll have Harold as speaker, and we'll be talking about.
Last people colors doing civil law and full freedoms from the Britain program.
And we will also have our students in class, and I really think it's very important for you all to meet our new students. And that's
Will it be March 2nd?
No,
Or the following week?
it's the second Monday.
Second Monday, okay.
So March 2nd is a Monday. It's not-
Very good speaker.
So I can say I've done to you. That's all. Just take. Yeah. Oh, yeah.